to present today.
That's a pleasure. Look forward to it.
Good morning, everyone. We are just waiting for people to arrive in the room, so just bear with us for a few minutes while I can see the attendees gradually entering the room. We would start directly on 10 o'clock so that we're all on time. Sorry, to start with a cough. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I am Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute, which is a think tank based in Edinburgh and established in 1985 to focus on the economy and related public policy. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's discussion, Delivering NPF4 and Behaviour Change to Achieve Net Zero. We have several speakers for you this morning and a lot to get through, so I will cover the welcome and how the session will work as quickly as possible to ensure there's maximum time for discussion and different people to air their views. Today's session is being recorded and it will be available on the CASH website afterwards. The webinar and the conference next week are jointly organised by the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing and Evidence, which I think is abbreviated as CASH. Cachet. I was wondering how elaborate we were going to be, and the members of the Housing and Place Delivery Forum, which is HPDF for short. This is a knowledge exchange initiative facilitated by CASH and consisting of housing, planning and the wider built environment professionals with the aim of delivering more high quality homes and places in Scotland. The conference on delivering NPF4 is a hybrid event which takes place on Monday next week. All the in-person tickets are sold out, but if there is anyone on this call that would like to attend, you can still register for online attendance, and Gareth will be sharing the details in the chat. Now, as no doubt many people on this call know, NPF4 is the National Spatial Strategy for Scotland and contains a set of national planning standards that aim to deliver more sustainable, livable and productive places. Climate change and achieving net zero are at the heart of the strategy, but much of what is proposed requires behaviour change at multiple levels. So in advance of today's discussion, you were sent 2 pre-recorded presentations to watch and consider. The first was from Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, the Director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. So thank you for joining us today, Lorraine. Lorraine is an environmental psychologist based at the University of Bath and is Director for the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation. She holds an ELC Consolidator grant, Understanding and Leveraging Moments of Change for Pro-Environmental Behaviour Shifts, not easy to say. She is the lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in Working Group 2, and is regularly advises governmental and other organisations on low carbon behaviour change and climate communications. And we'll hear a few introductory comments from Lorraine in a minute. The second presentation was from Christopher Martin, who is co-founder and director of Urban Strategy and Urban Movement at Urban Movement, a fully qualified urban designer and planner with over 18 years experience leading complex urban projects at all scales that address human connection, social equity and climate repair. In addition to his project work, Christopher serves on the board of trustees of the UK Charity for Everyday Walking, Living Streets, and he is vice chair of the UK Urban Design Group, a design council expert and a contributor to NACTO Designing Streets for Kids Design Manual, and a member of the United Nations Planning and Climate Action Group. My goodness, Christopher, thank you for making time for us today. So we're assuming attendees have watched and had time to consider the presentations from our first 2 speakers. If you haven't, you'll just be playing catch up, and please do watch them afterwards because they're very good. We'll get straight into the discussion. We'll have a few words from Lorraine and Christopher and then move into a larger panel with Ian Ackman, sorry if I've got that wrong, Ian, Chief Planning Officer at Scottish Borders Council, and Katie Bartholomew, Senior Policy Advisor at the Scottish Government. Unfortunately, we were hoping Duncan Smith from River Clyde Homes was going to be with us today too, but he's had a personal emergency, is unable to join us. But we know there are a number of house builders in the audience, so please don't be shy if you'd like to add your perspective on the conversation. There will be an opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A box. but please do put your name and let me know if you're unable to unmute to ask the question in person, because we quite like people to ask their questions in their own voices. We hope to have time to call on a few people, but if we can't unmute, do let us know and I'll ask the question for you. But as we get nearer the end, the time for questions is short, so please do get in quick, and I may have to group questions if we've got lots coming in to bring out key themes. So without further ado, Christopher and Lorraine, thank you for the advanced presentation. So Lorraine's was maintaining low carbon lifestyles and Christopher's was hedonistic urbanism, connecting self-interest and societal good. Could I ask you both to take a few minutes to remind attendees of the key messages and any comments or additional scene setting or reflections on each other's presentations that you'd like to say to get us started this morning? Lorraine, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thank you very much, Susan. It's really lovely to be with you. So I think the key things I was trying to get across in my talk are that we're not going to be able to fix climate change with technologies alone. We know behaviour change is going to be an absolutely essential part, but behaviour change is sometimes conceptualised quite narrowly as consumer behaviour change, so buying green products or maybe saving energy at home, or a certain narrow range of individual actions that people can take to directly reduce their carbon footprint. And while those things are certainly important, we actually conceptualize behavior change much more broadly as a range of different things that people can do across the roles that they occupy within their lives. So people are not only consumers, they're also citizens, so they can vote, they can protest, they can engage politically and call for wider structural societal change. They can invest their money in greener products. They can be a role model, so they can influence others in lots of different ways. Maybe they're a parent, or they're a member of a community, or there are lots of different sort of relationships that we have, and we can, through our actions, we can send a signal that a low carbon choice is a desirable choice. For example, we're often employees, or we might be employers, and through our professional decisions and actions that we can potentially exert a lot of influence and create change that way. So behaviour change actually spans potentially a lot more than maybe originally you might think, or certainly sort of in traditionally within a policy context is conceptualised. It's also worth saying that in order to achieve behaviour change, it's not enough just to give people information. That was one of the sort of key things I was trying to emphasise, that there are knowledge gaps that people have. So, for example, people do not generally know what are the most effective things they can do to help tackle climate change. They tend to vastly overestimate the importance of things like recycling, and underestimate the importance of things like reducing car use, flying, and dietary change. So we can inform people and educate people. That's important. And we also need to talk about the scale of behaviour change and societal change needed. That is an important conversation that we need to have nationally. But we need to go way beyond information provision to actually enable and encourage people to change their behaviour. So we need to remove the many barriers that there are to doing the right thing, because people do want to play a part in tackling climate change. They want to do the right thing, but often there are cost barriers, there are physical or infrastructure barriers. There may not be the service available to them or whatever. So we need policy often to play a big role in removing those barriers. We need economic policies, we need spatial built environment policies, etc., to create conditions that enable people to do the right thing, to change their behaviour. So we sort of talk about those being upstream measures as opposed to information provision, which is downstream. And in my talk, I gave various examples of different sorts of interventions and the extent to which they work. And one of the key things that comes out of the behaviour change literature is that it's ideal if you can combine a lot of these things. There is no silver bullet, so it's usually important to give people information, provide the right economic incentives, and remove the physical structural barriers or regulatory barriers. So many elements of an intervention are usually needed. And the final thing I mentioned was around when to intervene. So timing is really important. Habits can be a really big barrier to behaviour change. We're often on autopilot, but if we can actually get people to make greener decisions or low carbon choices at times when their habits are weakened, for example, when they've just moved house or starting a new job, they're much more likely to actually consider those options and to change their behaviour. So your interventions are more likely to be effective during moments of change, as we call them, sort of times of disruption, than at other times. And obviously we have to bring people with us. So it is important to actually engage with people, understand what might be the barriers to behaviour change. And that's a process, I think, that's really important as well. So I think those were probably the key points that I wanted to talk about, and really happy to take some questions if you have any. Oh, Susan.
Schoolgirl error there, sorry. One question before we move on to Christopher. There was a phrase used at the start, which about climate change being fixable. And it really jumped out at me, because actually what we're doing is having to adapt, because we know climate change is here and in our faces already. So for instance, the community and I live, we know our rainfall has gone up by 40% in terms of its intensity. And so it's not necessarily future, it's what we're already coping with now. And I kind of feel actually our politicians are letting us down by not talking about that. So if you, for instance, looked at the leadership election for Westminster, we had the now Prime Minister then talking about his children encouraging to recycle, and the scale of changes you mentioned in your presentation that we're going to need to do in our lives just aren't coming through. And I think that was something that really jumped out at me in terms of a reflection on the presentation you gave us. Anyway, I'll add my two pennyworth, stop my two pennyworth there. Christopher, over to you.
Thanks very much, Susan. I think some points from me. I think the first one is very much that sort of urban design, and essentially the design of human habitat is a science. But we really don't see it as such. We often see the design of animal habitat as a science, and we have a very great respect for that. But we don't really see it as such when we're saving our own skin. And I think we really have to start thinking about how we design our urban places in a way that yields the sort of greatest return on investment, because we're talking about a huge amount of money here normally. So how do we actually get a return on investment from those places for people and for place and for planet? I think often we see these kind of economic metrics as a way of sort of privatizing reward and risk and socializing reward and risk, rather than looking at actual habitat and how we can create places that provide a return on investment for the people, the place and planet. I think that's really key, and that's something we have to sort of change our mindsets in the future. Because I think really that the places we have designed in the past have shaped and will continue to shape our behavior. And I think the really difficult issue with behavior change is that behavior over time is culture. And so a lot of the time when we're dealing with behavior change, we are not dealing with changing people's behavior. We're dealing with changing people's culture. And that is a very different thing to conceptualize, and a harder thing. And I think that idea of how we use our urban environments to kind of incentivize and shape behavior and in time shape a new culture is a really key thing that we should learn. At the end of the day, I always think that transport should always be a servant to quality of life in urban environments. A lot of the time we have allowed transport to dominate our urban environments, and in a way we are servant to transport in a lot of places, and we see that everywhere in terms of a sort of car-orientated urbanism. We see that with the places that evolve from that are places where human beings are servant to vehicles. And I think that is the wrong way around, and actually transport has the power to improve our quality of life. And that is where we should be positioning transport. I think my kind of presentation is based on a theory of hedonistic urbanism, which I sort of developed, which is transport especially needs to incentivize us to change our behavior and change our culture over time. And we do so much because it's enjoyable and because it's fun. And we very rarely design urban environments and transport systems to yield fun and enjoyment. We look at how I suppose public transport and all the apps we have and everything, we can see that it's not about the experience, it's all about the sort of service. And I think that often loses half the picture, because essentially if we want someone to change their behavior, to do something differently, then the worst thing to do is to tell them to change, because then you get defensive and then you don't want to do it because someone's told you to do it. So hedonistic urbanism is the idea of making what's good for people in health terms, making what's good for society, and making what's good for the planet the most enjoyable option. So actually, people will queue up for it rather than feel they have to do it. And that's the kind of the premise of what I'm sort of looking at and how we shape urban environments to really incentivize people.
Thanks, Christopher. Lorraine, does fun come into your work very much?
Sort of, yes. I suppose it would come under the sort of category of making it more attractive to do the right thing. Absolutely. And I love the examples that Christopher gave in his presentation of how to do that. Because I think, as he pointed out, kind of people go with the easy option, but also they want to enjoy what they're doing. So I think making something easy and attractive is absolutely critical and sociable. And I think some of the examples that he gave as well around the sorts of ways in which people use space to spend time with people, to socialize, etc. That's a really important part of it as well. We are social animals. So I think all of those things, are really important, definitely.
So I'm going to turn quickly to the audience. If you've got any questions, do let us have them in the Q&A. We've got a couple of minutes for questions just of Lorraine and Christopher before we move on to the wider panel discussion. I'm not getting any questions just in yet, but I'll give them a couple more minutes. Are there Christopher, you mentioned fun. There's something that I've been considering. There's a lady called, I want to call her Mae West, but as I was told in the prep session for this, that's not her name. It's Mae East, who's done a PhD looking at the gender influences of how that affects people's movement in transport systems. And it really struck a chord with me because I'm not far from some of the new tram stops in Edinburgh, and some of them just aren't, that I don't feel safe using after night. So that affects my ability to use that bit of the transport network. And yet in the daytime, I think using the tram is fun and it's fast and it moves me around easily. But that nature of I wondered, and I've been in a few conversations over the years, do we think there's a gender influence in terms of transport, and actually do we need more female transport planners to come forward to influence how systems are designed?
Absolutely, we do. I mean, I think we always say when we're designing in the studio that I can't design the street I live on for me. I want something different from it in the morning, from the afternoon, from the evening, different times, different seasons, different stages of life. Everybody wants different things from their street. So without the perspectives of a full broad range of society and backgrounds and abilities, you're going to miss something. So 100% we need to be including everyone in the community and in the local area and in society in the design process. And that goes to the heart of co-design. And I think co-design is one of those words which I think it's been sort of slightly butchered over the recent years, and a lot of co-washing going on. But I think sort of genuine designing with the community is actually how you achieve those sort of things. And absolutely 100% we need a full spectrum and a full series of voices. And I think just coming on down to what you said about the Edinburgh Tram, sort of experiential design is something that is very common throughout different design studios. The design of experience. You think about website design, experiential design of websites is one of the sort of the biggest parts of designing a website. Like, is it a completely frustrating thing to use because someone's going to turn off it in 10 seconds? That's probably too long. But the same should apply to our urban environments. And I think, and our public transport systems especially, I think one of the key ones, just to illustrate that, is, I don't know about your local train station, but certainly when I'm going to get a train, there's always announcements saying that the train doors will close 2 minutes before departure. If the train doors are closed and I can't get on it, it's gone. So why is that kind of experience of don't say the train is 11:40 a.m. when actually it's 11:38, because then I'm going to change my schedule. So a transport system should be enjoyable and should be respectful to people. So if a train leaves at 11:40, then it should leave at 11:40, and I should be able to get on it until 11:40. If you want to make it leave at 11:38, then say it's 11:38. And I think it's just that idea of, we shouldn't be sort of patronizing people. We should be really wanting people to use these modes of transport. So stop making it so difficult.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question from Tessa Jones about Cairngorms National Park. Tessa, are you able to unmute and ask your question in your own voice? Gareth, are you able to work the magic tech? Well, we're waiting to find out if we can find out from Tessa. Oh, yes, fantastic, amazing.
Yeah. Great, yeah. Well, it's the Cairngorms National Park, where I live. The most visited part is the Glenmore Corridor, which is also a major destination for recreation, and it's also a highly designated area for both wildlife and landscape. So most people, that's visitors, access it with private cars. And at busy times, there are now severe parking problems. That's been kind of especially evident through COVID. There's strong resistance to restricting private vehicles for visitors and calls for additional parking. Being highly designated, it's very difficult to find areas for additional parking where you're not damaging the environment. There have been suggestions for many years of introducing a shuttle bus system. To date, this has always been shouted down, basically. And I wondered what suggestions there might be for how to try and turn this situation around and get transport that is sustainable successfully introduced.
Thanks, Tessa. Any thoughts from Lorraine or Christopher?
I think from my perspective, if you compare the sort of care taken in our sort of great national parks compared to, say, some of the huge ski resorts in Canada or North America or even sort of Europe, we think those are the same things, right? And can you drive into the middle of St. Moritz? No, you can't. And it's kind of these kind of things that we take for granted. And these things that we should be looking to, these places we should be looking to, kind of institutions of active lifestyles and leisure, and these great landscapes that we haven't really applied that to our thinking about our great landscapes in the same way, I don't think. So should we be allowing people to park all over the Cairngorms National Park? Probably not. And it just means we have to create a viable alternative, because we want people to still keep on visiting them. And we want more people to keep on visiting them. But if we want more people to keep on visiting them, we simply can't allow them to drive there, because then there'll be nothing left at the end of the day. It'll just be a big car park. So we need to think about these landscapes as the enormous assets that they are, and start to properly invest in attractive and convincing sustainable transport options to allow people to access them.
Many thanks. That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorraine. There's one that maybe you can build on if you've got an answer to Tessa as well. From Sarah Collins, she said she's wondering why reducing car use was given such prominence rather than decarbonising energy usage in homes, which would be less susceptible to the behaviour change question. And there's another question which we'll whiz through at the same time, thinking of the timeline and of behaviour change. Is behaviour change of politicians that which needs to be changed most, moving beyond the timeline of the parliamentary term? So we'll take those both together and then we'll move into the next panel session. So if you've got any reflections, Lorraine or Christopher on the second two questions, but Lorraine on all three questions, that would be marvellous.
Yeah, okay. So on Sarah's question around the focus on car use versus energy use in homes, I mean, I think they're both very important. They both account for a very large proportion of people's carbon footprints. So we do need to be both reducing car use and aviation actually, and energy use in the home, decarbonising that. But I would say both require behaviour change, depending on how you define behaviour change. The House of Lords recent review on the role of behaviour change in achieving climate goals defined it as having two elements. Part of it is about adopting new technologies, green technologies, for example, heat pumps or arguably insulation in homes, etc. So decarbonising homes would come into that to some extent, but then also wider behaviour and lifestyle changes, which might include reducing the amount of energy that we use, or changing diets, or etc. So not necessarily a technological switch, but changing behaviour in other ways. So if we sort of take that broader definition, then I think definitely decarbonising energy within homes would come under. It involves both of those types of behaviour change actually, and there are different barriers, but they're also important along with car use. Car use happens to be if you give up your car, it's the single best thing you can do to reduce your carbon footprint. But certainly we need to reduce energy or decarbonise energy in homes too. I didn't address the one about the timeline. I totally agree that we need to think about politicians' behaviours. Interestingly, colleagues are doing interviews at the moment with MPs, and they're very mindful of the political risks of doing things that might turn voters off and lose them an election at the moment. I mean, they always are, but the timing of those decisions, obviously leading up to an election, will be particularly relevant or top of mind. So I think thinking about sort of the decision making that happens within the policy context and how to change politicians' behaviours is at least as important as how to change the public's behaviours. That's why I sort of provided this broader definition of professional behaviour change as well as sort of personal behaviour change as well. So yes, completely agree.
If I can just touch on the on the car usage versus sort of energy as well. I think the issue with cars is they're incredibly space inefficient as well. And by their very nature, they actually make it very difficult to produce viable public transport systems and sustainable transport systems, because they're sort of the enemy of density in a way, because the cars are so space inefficient. You have to make roads yay wide, you have to make junctions yay big, and we have to store all these cars somewhere. So density actually gets damaged by car use, which means it makes it harder and harder and harder and harder to create a viable public transport system. And that's obviously a situation and a problem we have in rural areas. But you know, in urban contexts, they damage the creation of viable public transport systems. So that's why sort of reducing car use is key to that as well.
Mm-hmm. So just one final comment from me before we move on. The bit that scares me most, Lorraine, about the political cycle we're in at the moment is Nigel Farage, because he seems to have adopted an anti-climate change stance and has a fair amount of money going into lots of little community meetings around the UK, and is stirring up a lot of action that would have otherwise been good. And it made me, I heard Baroness Ashton speak this week, who used to be involved in a lot of diplomacy in the EU, and she said democracy is about our ability to respect each other as human beings. And that made me really think about some of the behaviour change that we're needing to do as a result of climate change, and whether or not we can respect each other and different viewpoints. And I'm not seeing some of that come through in some of the anti-low traffic neighbourhoods, which were getting coverage on the BBC yesterday.
I think that's a really good point. I think that's why I only sort of glossed over it very briefly at the end of my introductory remarks, but the importance of engaging with people is absolutely critical. So if the public perceive that behaviour change interventions are being imposed on them top down, and particularly if they don't see the benefit of those things or the rationale for those things, then they're understandably going to reject them. So we absolutely need to bring people with us and engage with people and understand their concerns and their needs. And they may have concerns about safety and air quality and all sorts of things that actually do relate to decarbonisation as well, that there might be common solutions and co-benefits. So if we can sort of engage with people and bring them with us through participatory processes sometimes, and obviously within Scotland there's been a great climate assembly, as well as in the UK. At local level there's lots of those sorts of things happening too. I think that's really critical, because we can't impose these sorts of things on people. So engagement is one way in which we can sort of try to bring people together through a respectful process.
Thanks, Lorraine. Right, I'm getting
muted.
I keep doing the wrong way around. It's because I keep coughing. I'm afraid everyone, my mute is on and off at the moment, so forgive my mute button slackness today. So I'm going to move to the wider panel now with Ian and Katie. Ian is the Chief Planning Officer at Scottish Borders Council, and Katie is the Senior Policy Advisor at the Scottish Government. Do either of you want to come in and have reflections on Lorraine and Christopher, and sort of cover a little bit about your own work before we open it up to broader questions? Katie, you're nodding vigorously, so I'll ask you to go first.
I can't see Ian, so I assumed he was also nodding, but Ian, I've pipped you to the post.
No, you're okay.
Right. Well, hi everyone. It's a real pleasure to be joining you all this morning. Yes, I lead the climate change behaviours team in Scottish Government. I've stuck my contact details in the chat there. And I'm just going to speak for a few minutes, reflecting on two ideas from Christopher and Lorraine's presentation, which strike a chord with our work in Scottish Government on changing behaviours to reach net zero. I wanted to pick out on two key ingredients for successfully changing behaviours. The first, and we've just been talking about it, policy making that's grounded in place. And the second, as we've also just been talking about, is about communicating a vision and a meaning and a culture for the net zero Scotland of the future. So first, on place-based policy making, I mean, Susan and Christopher, as you've just been talking about with co-design and involving women in planning their local transport stops, or Tessa, your community in the Cairngorms, Lorraine in her presentation emphasised the importance of taking into account the specific context which people live in as we work to change their behaviours, and that we need to think about how diverse people's homes and habits and communities are in order to make policy to influence their behaviours. I mean, I feel like I always hear people use the well-worn contrast between inner city Glasgow and a village in the Outer Hebrides. But it's true that those considerations are really vital for designing behaviour change interventions. And in the Scottish Government context, I just wanted to flag a piece of research we've commissioned, which will be published soon, so there's a sneak preview, into an interlinked practices approach, which shows why it's so important to design behaviour change interventions according to the place where a person lives. So the interlinked practices approach, it gets policymakers to think about how behaviours or practices are linked together in a person's life. So commuting is a good example. The practice of commuting to work may well be linked to safely dropping off 2 kids at school, arriving at work in a presentable uniform, on the way home, picking up the kids, picking up the food shopping, picking up the dry cleaning. And so when we see behaviours interlinked like that across real places, it's clear how simply switching a commute from car to bicycle isn't really a choice. That commuter needs an environment which enables them to switch to the low carbon option. And creating that enabling environment means getting a lot of policy areas to align. So in that small example of commuting, there's roads, education, workplace, retail. And this research shows that aligning those policy areas is best done at the community level, making the most of the resources and opportunities specific to that place. At Scottish Government, our policies are necessarily nationally focused, and we're at risk of being straitjacketed by sectoral silos. So we need to facilitate place-based decision-making and action. So Scottish Government has created tools like the Place Standard with a climate lens, and that's mentioned in NPF4's Livable Places policy. And that Place Standard is all about facilitating that sort of cross-sectoral conversation about climate and place at a local level. So communities can use tools like that to discuss and plan for more local living, including 20-minute neighbourhoods, enabling residents to easily access the facilities and services they need day to day, or to make that low carbon commute. Perhaps they might work that into a local place plan to support the preparation of the local development plan for the future development of their area. Or they might set up local heat and energy efficiency strategies, enabling residents to decarbonise their heating and to stay warm. So that was the first point on some of these sort of tools and the importance of making policy in place. The second point I wanted to pick up on is Christopher's on how cars have become part of Scottish or Western culture and part of people's identities. Our behaviours team in Scottish Government uses behavioural models to help policymakers, our colleagues, understand these kind of influences on their target behaviours. So we use the models which Lorraine talked about in her presentation, like COM-B, to analyse how behaviours might be driven by influences ranging all the way from big national infrastructure down to an individual's subconscious associations of meaning. And then we help sector colleagues to make their policy interventions as holistic as possible according to that behavioural analysis. And so on the question of meaning and culture as an influence, I just wanted to flag one of the downstream interventions we're using to try shifting the dial, which is going to be this year's Let's Do Net Zero campaign. Will be a big mass media campaign across Scotland later this year. And the aim is to boost the public's understanding of the climate crisis and what they can do about it. But what I wanted to emphasise is that the campaign will show a new culture for Scotland's net zero future, where cars aren't king. It's not going to show a place of sacrifice with Scots miserably cycling around in the rain and eating lentils. Instead, we want to show the co-benefits of low carbon actions, which people can already be doing where they live. So the campaign is going to be about showing more active Scots closer to their extraordinary natural spaces and more connected with one another in fairer, well-adapted places. And I really liked your challenge, Christopher, and Susan, you picked up on it as well, to think beyond net zero places which are positive and healthy, and to show a vision of a net zero future which is more hedonistic and fun. I found that really refreshing. So just to sum up, at Scottish Government, we're keenly aware of how urgent it is to bring the public with us on this vision, as you've just said, Lorraine, and to lay the groundwork for some of the difficult and unpopular policy decisions to come from national, local government, and indeed from the planners. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to the rest of this discussion, sharing ideas on how we pursue that bold and fair net zero agenda, how we emphasise the urgency of behaviour change, and create fairer places where that change is the obvious choice. Thank you all.
Ian.
Morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me along this morning. My name is Ian Aikman. Yes, well done. Got it right the second time. I've had worse versions, but I won't go into those. I'm Chief Planning and Housing Officer at Scottish Borders Council, but also a Chair of Heads of Planning Scotland for this year. I was going to sort of make some more sort of broad reflections on planning's response to NPF4 and I suppose the profession, as well as I suppose looking at more the mechanics of how we do it. A lot of and that will cross over with a lot of the themes that we've been hearing already. Obviously, from our perspective, NPF4 is a significant change in planning policy. It is far more prescriptive than previous Scottish planning policy, which is perhaps more suggestive and aspirational. There's a real drive within the NPF4 to move the agenda on and try and provide us with the tools to deliver that. And obviously that's significant weight given to global climate emergency in both plan making and decision making is something obviously which is a significant change and will have an influence in terms of how we operate in the planning system moving forward. But also it has that overriding policy principle in terms of looking at both reducing emissions but also addressing the nature crisis as well, which we've not really sort of touched on as much today. But also it's that looking at the question of delivery and the key theme of delivery. How do we deliver these elements in terms of both the spatial principles? How do we create sustainable places, livable places and productive places? And that's the key element of actually, well, we have as both planning authorities, the planning profession, heads of planning Scotland, be very supportive of the agenda and obviously have fed into government the development of the framework and looking to refine that. But actually it's how do we do it? If I've got a development management officer getting a planning application on their desk, how do they actually do that assessment? How do they make the change and how do they make I suppose, yeah, how do they understand as well what they're sort of required to do? So we've got these broad principles and there's a key drive of the agenda that we are very supportive of. But actually, what does it mean in practical terms to actually someone if you're getting a proposal coming forward? And I think that does need a culture change and behaviour change. That's both professionally, but societally as well. It's also a change in attitudes and some mindsets. And as a profession, the willingness to look at innovative solutions, but actually just to do things differently and be prepared to do things differently. And that's a personal journey, the journey for my staff and the planning profession, but also particularly, it's been referred to already this morning, it's our politicians and businesses and communities, as well as just us as citizens. As we've sort of experienced in our discussions and dialogue with those various parties, not everyone is willing to change. Not everyone's at the same stage in the journey. And indeed, from some recent discussions I've just had, not everyone's on the same page or indeed on the same planet in some respects. So there's still a few flat earthers out there. So there is a big education piece in terms of us moving that agenda forward. But obviously we need to do that on a collaborative basis, and actually we need to, I suppose, promote the theme of common purpose. That there is a common purpose to what we're looking to deliver. So from my perspective, I think our planning profession is in a strong position to deliver these things, but there's a number of things that we need to do in terms of that behaviour change, culture change, and actually just some basic things in terms of looking at, there's a whole series of new things we need to do that are required by the NPF4 and indeed the Planning Act. We need to make sure we've got the skills to deliver that, to understand that. So there's a big training piece in terms of upskilling staff, members of the public, members of our committees, who are making those decisions, so that they understand the consequences of not making the right decisions. We had a session with Gareth and his team looking at design values with our members, which again was a reflective piece. There's a need for us as professionals, but obviously in terms of the planning system as a whole and our communities, to actually look at being more reflective in terms of, let's learn from the good examples, let's learn from exemplars, let's promote exemplars, let's be a bit braver in terms of promoting some of these pilot schemes or proposals which are beyond the norm. There's also a piece in terms of, obviously, NPF4 is in a very good place, and it certainly sees a significant improvement on the earlier draft. But there's a lot of stuff in there that actually needs guidance. We actually need to understand what it is. So again, that's there's a commitment on behalf of Heads of Planning Scotland to work with government and others to actually say, well, how do we work through some of these issues on a practical level to actually get the guidance so that people know what they're required to do. There's a big point, and again, something we always talk about is actually, well, within the planning profession, we're key to delivering a lot of this, but actually we've seen significant cuts in our staff resources over recent years. RTPI survey and research in recent years has looked at the need for 700 plus planners over the next 15 years or so. Where are we going to get those from? So that, going back to sort of providing these sort of skills, but also that comes into, so, well, where are the undergraduate courses? Where are the postgraduate courses? Where are we getting people into the profession? So there's a big piece in terms of, if we're going to deliver this, we need to have people to do it, and they need to have the skills and ability to do that as well. So there's a broad range of things that we are obviously committed to. There's work we're doing in terms of our future planners programme, work within our HOPS, Heads of Planning Scotland, in terms of our subcommittees and developing that work and that interaction with government as well. And from my own authority's point of view, placemaking was mentioned by Katie there. We're obviously driving forward a placemaking approach to a lot of the delivery. Obviously, we're a rural authority, so a lot of the urban hedonism we won't have, but perhaps there's a rural hedonism that we can develop to engender that joy, and certainly it's a joy to live in the area that we live in. But that placemaking approach, I think, is critical, and that developing with communities, local place planning, and feeding into the development plan process as we move forward for the new round and new style of local development plans. So there's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of I think developing tools, and there's a lot of enthusiasm that we need to harness and make sure we're pointing in the right direction. So I'm conscious that I may have rambled on for a little while there, but happy to take questions and engage in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. I think you made some really, really important points there, and the fact that not everyone is on the same page is really important. Lorraine mentioned talking. I was talking to someone the other day, and they said, well, I just don't believe in climate change. And I said, well, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether or not you believe in it. It's not a religion, it's happening. You can choose whether or not you adapt your lifestyle or get involved in making your community a better place to be, but it doesn't fundamentally matter. You're not in control of it. And they were like, oh, no one's ever said that before. And I think just let's have some of those honest conversations. Katie, I'm really pleased to hear you mention the place standard. Our community went through it a good few years ago now, and it was a really good exercise because it allowed people that were experiencing a place differently to understand that not everyone's experienced the place the same as them, and for them to hear someone else describe a different aspect of where we all live was really, really useful. And I think Christopher's bit about children, I remember seeing an ARUP report by Sam, whose name is escaping me, a good few years ago now, maybe about 8 years ago, and Arup were trying to get people to design for children as the kind of lowest common denominator. And if you get it right for children, you get it right for the rest of society. So I think those are all really good points. The bit where we got stuck with our place standard was implementation, because we were just told, it doesn't matter if you're one of those things, no, it doesn't fit in. Which brings us on to Elsa's question from the Built Environment Forum Scotland. Elsa, are you able to unmute and ask your questions about local place plans? If we've not got Elsa, I will ask it directly.
Hello. Hi, Susan.
Hi.
Brilliant. Sorry, I was just waiting on the you can unmute button popping up. Good morning. It was really helpful to see local place plans referenced quite a few times, but I'm still concerned that without a mechanism for these to be resourced, how can they really deliver for communities and places? And just linking that to, I mean, obviously there's been a lot of discussion about behaviour change and talk of co-creation. All of these things take significant time, both in building and understanding what the community is for a local place, who that involves, and what they can take forward. And I'm very much pro the intent, but concerned as to how this happens in reality.
Who wants to start?
Can I maybe pop in on that? I'd mentioned obviously the work that we're doing with local place planning. That has been to a degree funded through the council, but obviously funded through the Borderlands city deal, growth deal, and that provided funding for 4 of our settlements to develop town teams and develop their local place planning. So that work is ongoing in terms of the with those communities, Eyemouth, Hoyk, Galashiels, and I've Jedburgh. Yeah, Jedburgh is the other one. But we've also introduced a staff resource as a council. We have 5 community engagement officers who work with our sort of our area partnerships, but also we have 2 specific officers within my team who are there to support the place planning approach. So the council has taken the view and made the investment in terms of seeing this as this is the correct approach to take in terms of placemaking, and allowing the development and funding some of the development of that place planning and the development of town teams. It's still at relatively early stages, but certainly we had an executive meeting yesterday where the feedback from members who've attended the various town teams and meetings is that there's significant public engagement. People understand place more than they understand. They'll go along to area partnerships, talk about this strategies, this, that, the next thing, and don't engage. But people engage with place, they understand it, and they've got a buy-in because it's talking about them, their lives. So placemaking is certainly seen by my council as a key means to drive forward a whole series of policy areas. So it's encouraging. Obviously, not all our authorities have. You get 34 versions of the process, but certainly it's something where, in a practical level, there are some authorities who are taking that. But you're correct. It requires resource and it requires people, but also it requires the ability to engage and get that enthusiasm from the communities to drive that forward.
Katie, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just very briefly, thanks Elsa for raising it. It's so important that the focus is kept on this. I have to say, I don't work very closely to this myself in government, but I was speaking to colleagues about it before this event, and they wanted to flag that Scottish Government has got a work stream looking at this, working with partners and planning on a skills strategy to understand where the gaps are. So yeah, acknowledge that this is a big issue and work's ongoing. Sorry for a very civil servant-y answer.
We're rapidly running out of time. I'm going to bring in David's questions, but I won't ask you to unmute, David, just for time reasons. So David Stewart says, I'm very supportive of NPF4 and of the ideas put forward by the panel. My question is, how can we support the development industry to move from low density greenfield development to brownfield mixed use? Do the panel have any? Oh, I can see Christopher's unmuted straight away. Christopher, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, if we're looking at house builders, I mean, the market is what house builders respond to, and that's completely fair. You know, at the end of the day, they're selling a product, and I think it's up to us to help house builders to make the case for something different. But equally, it's up to us to sort of help people and the customers to see the benefits of something different. And that's really the job. I think overnight, everyone wanted an iPhone rather than a Nokia 8210. And so we do this in every other industry all the time. And I think it's just about that case of making the change. What are the benefits of going from low density greenfield development to brownfield mixed use development? I think that's the story that we need to be marketing in that way. I don't think we market the design of our kind of developments that well in terms of what we are trying to achieve and the benefits that it can be yielded.
Thanks. I was recently in Lancashire, and it's an area of a really low tidal range. So the tide comes in really where it goes out, and you can see all the fields are flooded, but the fields which they're building thousands and thousands and thousands of houses on are soon going to be even more flooded. And I'm kind of like, aren't we just creating a problem here? And so I'm slightly more cynical, Christopher. Are house builders just building what's easy and creating a market around that by marketing? Because if you look at what won the Sterling Prize a few years ago, that was a social housing complex. Was it in Norfolk? If anyone correct me if I'm wrong. And it was amazing. People loved living there, and it was much higher density than is usually built by house builders. And particularly near me in West Edinburgh, we're getting greenfield sites. We know the area that they're built on floods. And yet we're getting thousands of the same houses that are built exactly the same as every other bit of the UK.
Yeah, I mean, and site allocation is the crux of it. I mean, if we don't want buildings to be built on a certain site, then we shouldn't allow them to be built on. I think that's something that the government has the power to control. I think we have to also engage with house builders in terms of what they are building, as we do engage with any other company. They are selling a product, and we have to try and influence what that product is. You don't see the kind of homes we build for sale in the Netherlands because there's just no market for them. And I think that's the same principle. We have to work with the market conditions that we exist in, and we have to try and influence that as best we can. Obviously, policy needs to sort of strip away the places that we just simply shouldn't be building on. That is a sort of another side of it. Completely supportive of that idea.
Yeah, but really, to bring it back to the focus of the session, when you've got house building targets, it's really hard to shift the mindset of, do we put the houses up quick and give people somewhere to live, or do we do that zonal, where do we prioritize the brownfield sites? I can see we've got a question from Joanna. Stephen Tolson, I'm going to squeeze your session slightly and take it. Joanna, are you able to unmute, and we'll just squeeze your question in?
Yes, yeah, it was really just to share some very recent experience of a capacity building programme that we've been delivering with Fife Council out in the rural communities of Fife. And what was very clear from delivering those training and mentoring, and it was peer support sessions, is that we cannot assume that communities, nor should we, have that sort of basic knowledge of the planning system. And then overlaying planning and community planning. So we're talking to them about local place plans, we're talking to them about local outcome improvement plans, we're talking about the LDP. So what we found was there was a need just to have introductory sessions about what all of that complex framework means for them. And it was very successful, and we're hoping to continue that and indeed do it in other places across Scotland. There's a real appetite for it. And I just wonder what the panel think in terms of the challenge around that for beginning to introduce net zero into that, because of course the place standard with the climate lens tool, we use that with communities as well, but it just strikes me that there's a real need for knowledge sharing if this is to be really embraced by communities.
Thanks, Joanna. I am going to come to the panel each, and I think I'll come to Lorraine first to follow up on Joanna's point there. And do you want to leave everyone with one last sentence, maybe two, before we go to Stephen to sum up? Lorraine, do you want to go first?
Yes, I can try. I think there is an important point about the extent to which people need to be trained, and it depends, I guess, what we're asking people to do. One of the, I mentioned some of the knowledge gaps that people don't necessarily know what's most effective, but if we are hoping that people will be involved in the planning process, then absolutely, I think there will need to be sort of support for that, and resources were also touched on as well before. So yes, I think so. I'm not sure. I mean, the other thing I think I wanted to kind of link it back as well to the engagement toolkit that we developed for Scottish Government, which I put a link for in the chat, because I think it's also about this sort of making change desirable. It's something that the other speakers have also talked about, that we want to be able to kind of create an aspirational sort of future for people where it's not about giving things up, it's about actually creating places that people want to be, and it's about addressing the needs that they have. So there are sort of communication resources that can be used to achieve that as well, and the sort of pen portraits that we created that show how that can look in different Scottish communities is part of that. So I don't know if that's sort of a little bit tangential, but I thought it might be relevant to link that in as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Lorraine. Christopher, do you want to come next?
Sure. Yeah, I think the crux of it really is sort of empowering communities wherever they are, and seriously letting people know what good looks like. I think that's the key message. I think we, as consumers, we can only buy and select what we know. And I think empowering communities and letting people know what they can have and what good looks like is at the heart of all this.
Brilliant, thanks, Christopher. Katie, a couple of sentences.
Yeah, I think we're all agreed on why this is so important, why it's so important bringing communities in that to design their place together and enable that behaviour change. So the difficult question for all of us now is how are we making that a reality? Thanks.
Fantastic, thanks, Katie. And then Ian.
I'm mute at the right bit. Yeah, I think making it happen obviously is the key thing that I sort of focused on. But I suppose picking up on the last couple of comments about empowering in communities, we're not going to deliver it unless actually our communities are empowered to do that. But that requires to build up trust, and that is something which has been lost in the political dialogue over recent times. So that getting trust and getting understanding of the issues, and I think the route to that is through the placemaking approach. So that's what I would leave people with. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks, Ian. Right, I'm now going to hand over to Stephen Tolson. So he's an expert with over 30 years experience in this sector and someone who many of you will know. Stephen's the chair of the group delivering the conference on Monday, and he'll provide some final thoughts on reflections. I've massively squeezed your time that was allotted, Stephen. I hope that was okay, but we could have spent the whole day, I think, on behaviour change in places. And so I took advantage of the fact that maybe you could summarise quite a little bit quicker. Hope that was okay.
4 minutes, no, not very much time really, so I'll go straight to it. I think this engagement is coming out from all speakers, and I think I would stress, Ian made a point as well about this engagement. It's about community engagement, it's engagement with citizens, it's engagement with businesses, and we have to understand the differences between individuals and the community. We gloss over it far too much. You know, the Germans have it Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, and we have to understand that. We live in a society which is very much geared to individualism these days. 40 years of policies that focus on individuals, and planning has stood for the common good, and the public benefit is often thrown around, which is more community-based than individual-based. We've got to get to grips with that. If we don't, it's not going to work. And frankly, you know, that point about convenience and familiarity, Christopher made some good points in his video. That's the kind of stuff that I think we need to focus on. What is it that we have to do to incentivize? Yes, by all means, educate, which sounds a little bit patronizing, if I may say so, to the general public. But what is going to incentivize the general public into that behavioral change? And it's change that has to be done extremely quickly. Behavioral change is a generational change, and my definition of that is at minimum of 20 years. We haven't got time for that. So how we do it? So we have been talking around the subject, but we've got to hit the how. And for me, that is down to politics. We've got to have much stronger political leadership, much better quality of debating this amongst ourselves and recognizing that we've got to find consensus here. Because we're poles apart, we have nations that are polarized into different camps. Somehow we've got to get some cooperation going, and that is a massive challenge. That's all I'm going to say, other than to suggest, it's been mentioned before, Panorama did an interesting program all around this subject about behaviour. It's called Road Wars, and it's looking at low traffic neighbourhoods based around in Oxford, which is a good watch, and it's everything you'd expect, and it's everything about all the problems that we're faced with. So good luck to everyone in delivering this NPF4. It's not without its challenges. Can I just finally say that we need to take a lot of this stuff today to our symposium on Monday, because Monday is our big day where we bring a whole load of sessions, and behaviour will be fundamental to all of these aspects that we talk about: housing supply, brownfield development, vacant derelict land, fixing what we've already got, to pick up the point one of the delegates talked about today about energy and so on. All of these are extremely important. So behaviour should not be seen in the narrow way. It should be seen as all of society's functioning. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Stephen. What a way to finish off. I've really enjoyed the session. I'm sorry, everyone. It's felt really like we've crammed so much into the hour. I want to finish directly on time. So please do, all of you that are going to the conference on Monday, enjoy and bring behaviour change into every conversation, because I think it's really, really important. For those of you not registered, remember you can still register online to attend. There's lots of information out there. When we were preparing for this session, Stephen mentioned the Panorama thing. I also remember watching Dr. Zander van Tulken a few years ago doing a program about air pollution and working with communities, and that was all about traffic and behavior change, and it was absolutely fascinating. So you'll also find things like that online, and I'm a bit of a groupie of the world placemaker Brent Todderan from Canada. So all of those things, do immerse yourself. I think I will leave you with the thought that we all need to be all those things that Ian was urging us to: thinking widely, absorbing broadly, and able to have conversations with lots of different people that aren't necessarily in our field, because it's not going to be one field that tackles these problems alone. So we all need to work together. So best of luck with everything everyone is working on, and don't be strangers. Please do use all the contacts that were introduced in the chat today and connect, because it's only through the connections and conversations that we will take this agenda forward. So thank you very much, everyone. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.